regardless of your background. We just want to make sure that everybody's included and everybody feels welcome. So we're going to start with the format of 8 minute to 10 minute opening statements from each side. Then we're going to move to 40-minute open discussion, followed by a 25-minute Q&A. So if you have any questions, tag at Modern Day Debate, and we will get to your questions. All right, we're going to start with Ben Fischer on the topic, does God exist? Ben?
Well, thanks so much. I'm grateful to have had the opportunity to come on to tonight's program. So thanks, Modern Day Debate, for folding me into their schedule. And as well, a special thanks to Benjamin Watkins for being part of tonight's discussion. I'm certainly looking forward to a wonderful exchange of ideas. Now, in our discussion, I'm going to be making two main contentions that one, philosophical and therefore religious skepticism is now a soundly defeated argument within secular academia, and that number two, theism has a number of strong arguments in its favor. So I'm going to be looking forward to presenting both arguments tonight and offering various reasons in their defense. But for my opening statement, I'm going to be explaining why religious skepticism is now a soundly refuted argument, as I believe that this will add strength to my later arguments for God's existence. So let's go ahead and answer that essentially by setting the stage. What caused the problem of skepticism to first become within Western civilization? Well, skepticism essentially broke onto the scene of history at a time when ancient Greek philosophers were starting to become prolific at asking questions. Questions such as, how do we know anything? Can we know anything? If we can know anything, what is the proper method for knowing it? Other questions were also asked, which were aimed at even more fundamental issues, such as, what is knowledge to begin with? Is it something that we can define? If we can define it, what are the necessary characteristics of it? Now, amid the sea of swirling questions, there were two main inquiries which emerged and drew the most attention from early Greek philosophers. And they were, one, what is knowledge? And two, how do we get it? Now, the first question was considered for some centuries to have been decisively answered by the early Greek philosopher Plato, who held that knowledge contained three essential ingredients to it: proof, truth, and belief. And so it seems that for Plato, there simply had to be something more to knowledge than a person's mere belief that something was true, joined together with the fact that he was right. Instead, there needed to be some sort of a proof or justification for that belief. And so thus, according to Plato, justification was the needed ingredient to properly bracket truth and belief together under knowledge. And for centuries, most philosophers thought that Plato was right. Almost no one questioned his views. But in 1963, an American philosopher, Edmund Gettier, published a brief paper which challenged Plato's classical definition of knowledge. Using a set of counterexamples, Gettier was able to demonstrate that Plato's definition had been incomplete all along. Instead, it was possible, said Gettier, for a person to believe something which was true and to have a reasonable justification for that belief without that belief necessarily counting as knowledge. And the result of Gettier's paper was a tremendous upheaval amongst modern philosophers to identify what had been missing from Plato's classical definition. Precisely, what was it? Was it warrant? Was it vindication? Was it something else no one had ever thought of before? No one was able to say. Now, of course, the reason why this was such a problem for most modern philosophers is that unless we had a working definition for knowledge, we really could have no assurance on how to get it. And so it's therefore a somewhat comical joke of Western academia that to date, no one has been able to offer a convincing reply to Edmund Gettier's paper. So therefore, in response to our first question, no, modern philosophers don't really know how to define knowledge. So then what about our second question? Well, the second question is, how do we get knowledge? Now, for most of us, this is probably the more relevant issue for tonight's discussion. How do we decide, for example, that we really know that God exists? Is there some sort of a rational way to settle a question like that? Well, classically, skeptics have argued, again due to Plato's influence, that it is impossible for human beings to really know anything. Now, while the mere mention of the idea tends to elicit roaring laughter from some people, it is nevertheless a belief which has historically been immensely successful. And the reason is that it seems to be based on a principle which virtually all philosophers agree is true, called the closure principle. And the closure principle essentially states that in the case of any pair of opposing claims, if we know one is true, we also know the other is false. And so for this reason, the skeptic's argument winds up looking surprisingly good as we go about the business of simply minding our P's and Q's, Observe, if I know that P is true, I also know that Q is false. I cannot know that Q is false, therefore I cannot know that P is true. Now notice here that we are already seeing the very core inspiration for religious skepticism beginning to take shape. So if you don't see it yourself, simply listen to what happens when we restate the argument like this. If I know that Christianity is true, I know that Hinduism is false. I cannot know that Hinduism is false. Therefore, I cannot know that Christianity is true. And so for this reason, we can see that the skeptic will not succeed in defending his views tonight if he argues that religious skepticism is somehow different from philosophical skepticism. Well, moving on, the argument of skepticism has been powerful and perplexing. Almost no one in history has been able to soundly address it. But through an unexpected series of events, probably triggered mostly by Edmund Gettier, the chief premise for the skeptic's argument was brought into question. And this occurred as another American philosopher by the name of Robert Nozick set about trying to repair Plato's original definition of knowledge. And what happened next inadvertently became the basis for refuting skepticism. So here's how Nozick did it. First, let's consider the most vivid example of skepticism ever conceived. It's the story film depiction of the now infamous brain in the vat argument. The movie was released in 1999 by the famous film director duo, the Wachowski brothers, and it later went on to become their biggest smash hit. The film, as many of us know, is entitled The Matrix, and it told the story of a man who suddenly unplugged from a computer, only to discover that up until the present time, his entire life had been nothing but a dream. Well, the film portrays the struggles of the character, named Neo, to adjust to the world as it actually is. His life lived as a brain in a vat had deceived him regarding the true nature of his existence. Sentient machines had cleverly wired his cerebrum to stimulate his brain to accept his false experiences. And of course, this only raised the question for most moviegoers, how can we be certain that the Matrix does not exist? Well, naturally, few of us tended to be detained by the Matrix question for very long. Most of us probably dealt with it by shrugging our shoulders and having a sandwich. But for Nozick, stories like The Matrix prove an extremely invaluable point. Namely, they show that the argument of skepticism is now baseless. Now, to see why Nozick thought so, try imagining the following fanciful scenario. What would have happened if the machines themselves had decided to tell Neo that his body lay invatted in a tube of biodegradable goop? That's, of course, assuming the machines can really decide to do anything. Well, if this had happened, Neo would immediately be in a position to know that the real world lay utterly beyond his present empirical borders. But this, of course, raises the question, does this count as knowledge? The problem was that under Plato's classical definition, it did. In fact, this point becomes all too easy for us to see as we simply reconsider Plato's criterion for knowledge alongside the present case under discussion. Give it a listen. 1. Belief. Did Neo believe the machine? Well, by supposition, we are saying that he did. 2. Truth. Was the machine story true? Well, yes, Neo was plugged into a computer. 3. Proof. Was Neo's belief justified? Well, the machine was the one who told him. But the question was, did this really count as knowledge? Was it? Well, our hesitation to answer yes, said Nozick, was a sign that something was wrong. Recall here that Gettier had argued that something was missing from Plato's classical definition. Scenarios like this one seem to show that Gettier was right. But that wasn't all that they seemed to show. They also purportedly pointed to the need for a new criterion in which the rule, if P not Q, begins to be seen as not a reliable method for leading us to knowledge. For could readily affirm that he was in the matrix P, as well as deny the claim that his senses were not deceiving him Q. The problem was that Neo's awareness wasn't due to his personally sensing it. And so therefore the rule, if P not Q, if this not this, cannot really be trusted to always lead us to knowledge. Now, before we go any further, it's probably important for us to chase down a distracting question. Why be concerned in the first place about whether or not the rule, if P not Q, will always lead us to knowledge? Isn't this a bit unnecessary? The answer, however, is that the first premise in the skeptic's argument flatly presupposes that it is a necessary step. So to see why, try rewinding your memory to any conversation you ever had with a skeptic. In virtually all cases, whenever you attempted to explain your Christian beliefs, didn't your skeptic friend simply invent some sort of a plausible sounding contradiction to one of your beliefs out of thin air, and then immediately suggest that unless you could refute his contradiction, you really couldn't know if your belief was correct? Well, in such cases, it probably would have been handy for you to know that denying Q will not always lead us to a knowledge of P. Instead, there will be times in which the principle, if P not Q, will fail to lead us to knowledge. And this will invariably occur whenever we insist that something is true entails our personally sensing it. So with this in mind, let's return to the religious skeptic's argument and see for ourselves how this begins to affect things. Premise 1, if I know that Christianity is true, I know other religions are false. Premise 2, I cannot know other religions are false. Therefore, premise 3, I cannot know Christianity is true. Now, as we read through the above argument, it's obvious that the entire abstraction turns on the second premise. In other words, premise 2 is really the central premise, which most directly determines the outcome for the skeptic's argument. The question for us is this really true that we cannot know that all other religions in the world are false? Well, the skeptic who answers yes usually insists that the reason we cannot know that other religions are false is because we're not in a position to personally sense it. For example, we can't see spiritual things. These sorts of realities are not empirically beholden to us, and so therefore we cannot know that all of the religions in the world are false, or so the skeptic claims. The problem is that we've seen that making sensitivity a requirement for knowledge causes the rule of P not Q, if Christianity, not other religions, to fail to lead us to knowledge of Christianity. And so therefore, by defending the second premise of the argument in this way, the skeptic has imploded the first premise of the argument, which means the conclusion is now invalid. So at this point, if you can't see why this is significant, you're probably just not paying close enough attention. And the reason is that virtually all arguments from religious skepticism basically assume Nozick's sensitivity requirement as a necessary requirement for religious knowledge. Now, throughout our debate, we'll see how all-encompassing this objection really is and how devastating it is to current-day versions of atheism, and I really do think that it offers somewhat of a good refutation for some of the thinking that underlies the theory. So, in our talk, I'll begin to talk about cases for God's existence, and we'll talk about evidence, but in the meantime, I just wanted to lay this out as a necessary framework, perhaps, to our broader discussion. So, I'll go ahead and hand over the mic back to our moderators, and we'll, I suppose, continue our interesting discussion from there. Thanks
so much, Ben. With 3 seconds left on the clock. That was pretty close. Good work. Good work. Yeah, okay. For sure. All right. So we will kick it over to Ben Watkins for his opening remarks.
Okay. So I want to first say that our question is, does a God exist of religious significance? So I want to first talk about the concept of God that I'll be criticizing tonight. So the first layer of the concept would be what I call the supernatural agent thesis, where a God is a disembodied, immaterial mind that causally interacts with the world. The second layer is what I'll call the perfect being thesis, where God is a perfect and personal being who is worthy of our worship. Such a being would have the essential divine properties of infinite power, perfect knowledge, perfect goodness, and perfect love. And the last layer that I would add on to it would be the biblical thesis. So tonight I'm taking God to be the only disembodied, immaterial mind who is always worthy of our worship is the God of the Bible. So I want to present some arguments basically attacking these different conceptions of what a God could be. So the first one I want to start with is the biblical thesis, because one of the things that's very common to particular religious traditions is miracle claims, and miracle claims are often given as evidence for the truth of some religion. So according to traditional Christian theology, Jesus died from crucifixion and came back to life 3 days later by an act of God's will. But what should we make of such a miraculous claim? When does evidence of testimony give us sufficient reason to believe miracle claims? The evidence of testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle if that miracle's having actually occurred is more likely than not conditional upon the occurrence of the testimony. Should we believe Jesus really was miraculously risen from the dead by God based on testimony? I argue we should not, because the falsehood of testimony on behalf of miracles of a religious nature is more likely than Jesus' resurrection. So my first premise A will be, if it is more likely than not the testimony surrounding Jesus' resurrection is false, then we should not believe Jesus was resurrected. It is an empirical fact that testimony evidence for miracles are notoriously unreliable because they have a high false positive rate. Eyewitness testimony of miraculous events are prone to error, exaggeration, and deception. What we know about human psychology should make us downgrade our confidence in the reliability of testimony on behalf of miracles, especially ones of a religious nature. So my premise B will be, it is more likely than not the testimony surrounding Jesus' resurrection is false. Therefore, conclusion C, we should not believe Jesus was resurrected. When we are presented with testimony of a miraculous event, we have to ask ourselves a question. Have the laws of nature been suspended in favor of some religious group, or has some other mistake been made? I've argued here the latter is more likely given the available evidence. Now I want to turn and attack the perfect being thesis, and mention a familiar problem, the problem of evil. The problem of evil for theism is the tension which arises between the properties attributed to God and facts of the kinds, amounts, and distributions of evil in our world. According to biological evolution, the biological role of pain ensures our world is full of suffering, and the distribution of it appears mostly random. 99.98% of species which have ever existed are now extinct because sentient creatures are in savage competition with one another for limited resources. In other words, survival is the exception and extinction is the rule. Some people even suffer so horrendously they lose themselves entirely. They come to believe their lives are, on the whole, not worth living. Why would a perfect being create a world full of so much seemingly random evil like human and non-human animal pains, natural disasters, and circumstances of injustice? These facts about suffering seem in some way incompatible with an infinitely powerful and perfectly good person. What reasons could such a being have for allowing these kinds of evils? God might use some evils as a means to achieve some greater good, or as a means to prevent some evil equally bad or worse. We can call evils which achieve neither of these goals unjustified evils. Premise D, the omnipotent God has the ability to prevent all unjustified evils. Premise E, a perfectly good God would be maximally motivated to prevent unjustified evils. Therefore, conclusion F, the perfect being thesis implies a God-created world would contain no unjustified evils. So it must be the case either premise G, there has never been any unjustified evil and all seemingly unjustified evil is illusory, or premise H, there has been at least one unjustified evil. Most evil seems pointless because it really is pointless. Premise G is implausible. The agony of being eaten alive, the terror of being raped, and the anguish of losing a child to disease really do seem pointlessly evil. We have no reason to believe them necessary for achieving any greater good or preventing some evil equally bad or worse. Our world would be, on the whole, much better if there was less evil in it. However, H is just what you would expect, given the non-intentional process of biological evolution, the indifferent laws of nature, and finite creatures with limited altruism. Appearance and reality about unjustified evil would coincide if atheism were true. But if that is true, then it follows, conclusion I, the perfect being thesis is false. I would now want to switch to a variation of the problem of evil, the problem of divine hiddenness. For many people, myself included, God can seem indifferent, distant, silent, and hidden. Some, over time, come to no longer believe there's a perfect being, and this lack of belief or absence of belief is not the result of emotional or behavioral opposition towards God. Let's call these people non-resistant non-theists. So why is God's existence not more obvious to them? A perfectly good and loving God could create such that anyone could enter into a relationship with him simply by trying. Premise J, God's perfect goodness and love imply he would always be open to relationship. God's openness would ensure no action he took put relationship out of reach. Additionally, a belief that God exists is a necessary condition for entering into a meaningful and positive relationship with him. So all non-theists must be resisting God in some way. So premise K is, if God is always open to relationship, then every finite person must believe God exists unless they are somehow resisting such a belief. Therefore, conclusion L, if the perfect being thesis is true, then there are no non-resistant non-theists. Former theists like myself were already in a relationship with God, and a loss of belief terminated that relationship. Some lifelong seekers are open to finding or being found by a perfect being without ever achieving that goal. Additionally, isolated non-theists have never been in a position to resist belief because they've never had the idea of a perfect being. Consequently, isolated non-theists unavoidably live their entire lives with the influence of a fundamentally misleading system of religious meaning. So since clearly, premise M, there are some non-resistant non-theists, therefore, conclusion N, the perfect being thesis is false. I now want to turn my attention and attack the supernatural agent thesis by appealing to facts about the physical dependence of minds. So what if there's at least one less than perfect disembodied mind or immaterial mind? What about the supernatural agent thesis? I want to argue what we know about minds strongly implies there are no disembodied immaterial minds. Let's start with a general fact about minds. All known mental activity such as psychological capacities, personality, memory, have a physical basis in embodied brains. In other words, we have never observed something mental happening without some prior physical process happening. The first thing I want to point out is that this observation is consistent with what's known as the causal closure of the universe. According to the conservation of energy, the universe is a closed system, so there is nothing outside of space-time which can reach into the universe and increase the net total energy. The second point I'd like to point out is that this observation does not imply mental states are identical with brain states. At most, this observation implies mental activity is causally dependent on complex physical neuronal circuitry. All parties to the discussion can agree that premise O provides at least some evidence against immaterial minds. But let's look at a more particular fact, premise P. A person's brain can be damaged such that the person is unconscious. If all minds are physically dependent on embodied brains, then what would sufficiently explain P? Why would P be the case if there is an immaterial mind which can exist independently of any physical structure? We might expect such an injury to damage communication between an immaterial mind and a material brain, with the result the person's behavior ceases, but there is no reason why the immaterial mind should stop having mental states, like thoughts and feelings. Therefore, other things being equal, P favors the view there are no immaterial minds over the view there are some immaterial minds. Let's consider a more particular fact to drive this point home. The probability that a given person will have certain psychological traits is a function of whether their parents did or did not have those traits. Again, if the mind is immaterial, how do we explain this fact? Why should there be any correlation between the personality traits present in an immaterial mind if a person's parents and those present in the person's own material mind? By contrast, if there is no immaterial minds and all mental activity is physically dependent, then genetics will give us a perfectly sufficient explanation. Premise S, the supernatural agent thesis implies there are some disembodied minds. Premise T, there are not any disembodied minds, therefore, conclusion U, the supernatural agent thesis is false. So what have I done? I've laid out 4 arguments. One of them is against a biblical thesis. 2 of them, the problem of evil and the problem of hiddenness, are against a perfect being thesis. And the physical dependency of mind is against the supernatural agent thesis. So how am I for time? Did I go over?
Yeah, but we're flexible. If you need to finish up the argument,
I'm good. I'm good.
Yep. All right. Well, thanks so much for that interaction there. I mean, I really there's a lot of information on both sides, and I think we got some really intelligent people tonight debating. So I'm glad to actually see this. I might actually have to watch it back because I'm watching the comments and so forth. But again, thanks for that. And if you haven't yet, like this video and or subscribe if you haven't. Also, become a patron if you like this type of material and help support the channel. James is doing so much right now, and I'm trying to help him out. But you know, there's obviously a lot that we can do to support content like this. So thanks so much for tuning in. And what we're going to do now is we're going to move into the open discussion, 40 minutes. And I guess we'll let Ben Fischer kick it off and maybe start some responses.
Okay, so the format here is that I will go ahead and ask Mr. Watkins questions. That's essentially it, and then we'll kind of go with.
Well, we're just going to do an open discussion. So, okay. But you can start it off because he just got through. Maybe there's some things you want to start with.
Okay. Yes. Well, there are a couple of things. These would just be questions that I happened to jot down as I was listening to your opening paper here. In response to your objections concerning the biblical thesis for the existence of God, that would be based on the proof of Jesus' bodily resurrection. You mentioned that essentially you mentioned that the testimony of historical evidence is not a reliable medium for conveying something as miraculous as the resurrection, the bodily resurrection of Jesus. And my question here would be, what other evidence but written literary testimony could we rely upon to validate some sort of an event, be it miraculous or otherwise, that had taken place in the past? So that's my first question. And then in regards to the supernatural agent thesis, I wanted at some point to offer something that I've come to refer to as the axiomatic argument for God's existence, as I think it's a fairly strong one. in regards to this type of discussion. So certainly it would be wanting to hear from you. What are your thoughts on the problem here presented, that seems to be presented, that all we would be able to rely upon in the case of a bodily resurrection, an event, a miracle that took place long ago? It seems that we are at a lack of something else other than written testimony to rely upon which basically to base to essentially ground the event. So could you speak to that a bit? I think that would be interesting.
Sure. So the way that I would phrase it is that the evidence that we need in order to justify such a miraculous claim is not the evidence that we have. So that when we look at the total evidence, that we don't have any reason to believe that these testimonies surrounding the bodily resurrection of Jesus are any more likely than any other religious testimonies of miraculous events of other religious natures. So if we had better evidence, more of it, especially more contemporary evidence, then that's what would help raise the scales in favor. But as it stands right now, so to just take a random hypothesis, the idea that someone stole the body, that right there is more intrinsically probable of an explanation, just because it does not violate the laws of nature and is more consistent with what we already know about testimony, given the religious nature of testimonies about miracles.
Right. Now, we can't start the debate from ruling out the possibility of miracles from the get-go. We have to allow the evidence to stand on its own regard. But I find it interesting.
Agree.
This little bit that you mentioned here. Oh, okay, good. So I find it interesting. If I know that Jesus was bodily raised, if I know this miracle is right, how am I then to judge whether or not all the other miracles are false? I cannot know that the other miracles are false. Therefore, I can't know that Jesus was bodily raised. This is essentially the very argument that I spent time at the beginning essentially refuting. The idea that this sort of an argument form based on classical methodological skepticism, sort of reformatted in a religious milieu, that this kind of an objection works because it's relying upon, again, Nozick's sensitivity requirement. That is, our belief that these other naturalistic hypotheses is insensitive. Therefore, we're not able to know whether or not these other alternatives are false. This is a classical religious skeptical defense of premise 2 in the argument, which doesn't work for some of the reasons I mentioned.
So I don't think I would use the argument as you formulated it and what you were criticizing a lot in your opening. So what I'm making is an epistemological argument. So we're asking, can we have knowledge of Jesus's resurrection? Or that we could have knowledge of it. So if we believe that Jesus was resurrected from the dead, can that belief be justified? And I'm saying that if we look at the available evidence, it's not justified based on the available evidence. The available evidence would have the scales tip in favor of the resurrection not happening. So this puts all worries about skepticism aside. I will concede to you that knowledge is possible, that we can believe things and give justification.
I'm not saying that you are saying
questions and give true answers to them.
Yes, I wouldn't be so unwise as to suggest that you think that knowledge is impossible, but you certainly do seem to be skeptical of the possibility of religious knowledge.
No, not at all. I wouldn't say that at all. So I'm a philosopher of religion. So I just don't believe that there is this perfect disembodied mind. I think that is a product of human superstition and societal dogma. I think that our religious concepts need to evolve, and they need to become something more along the lines of a pantheistic religious conception, where we see nature as something that's worthy of our worship, and that prayer would look more like something like meditation. So I guess I'm getting into that. That's my project with Real Aid Theology, is to explore what religion can look like once we have discarded theism.
Right. And essentially, I think that most of us on the theistic side are going to be fairly persuaded that the arguments for the resurrection, the bodily resurrection of Jesus, do stand on their own merit, that they do offer a clear supernatural event as being the best explanation for the historical evidences that we do have, which are left to us. And I think this is where essentially, we're sort of parting company here. I think that one of the things which most of us find to be so remarkable is that obviously upending the resurrection is going to demand in the first place that there's some other explanation that we can give, which prompts the Easter message. And about this, William Paley wrote some centuries ago, quote, "The ruling party at Jerusalem had just crucified the founder of the religion. They who stood forth to preach must necessarily reproach these rulers with an execution they could not but represent as a murder." And so the notion of interreligious borrowing therefore seems to strain credulity, which is very often put out by atheists these days. Jesus' disciples were clearly facing a deadly threat, so they weren't playing religious jazz here and inventing some sort of a strange idea that on the basis of perhaps the remains of pagan myths. And so the motive behind the message would need to be something of the sort which would somehow produce the willingness to hazard the danger expected. And again, as Paley noted, quote, "Ordinarily speaking, nothing can overcome the the indolence of mankind, but the love of cheerful society, the desire of personal freedom, these cannot be surmounted. The only thing that can is conviction." And the point is certainly to most of us appropriately stated. So therefore, we have to conclude that the cause of the message was somehow deeply arresting to the earliest disciples. The movement of early Christianity could not have started otherwise. Something powerful had to occur to elicit the belief that Jesus of Nazareth was now risen from the dead. And so therefore, the common claims, perhaps rabbinic Judaism, somehow birthed a pagan hybrid. This sounds unrealistic to most of us because whatever the disciples saw, it dramatically altered their Judaism without the aid of stories borrowed from ancient cultic myths. It's simply an unrealistic hypothesis. And so from that point, the case for Easter begins to narrow significantly. The list of probable options dramatically shrinks. Hallucinations, for example, become an unlikely candidate for producing religious visions, which were so different from early Jewish beliefs. The fact that skeptical scholarship has at times argued the pagan route to Easter suggests that the case indeed cries out for some kind of external inspiration. So hallucinations cannot account for the disciples' visions, since religiously inspired delusions are simply projections of our own minds. And so things like that are the reasons why a lot of us are convinced that the story which lies behind the historical facts itself, we're trying to get at that story. What did the facts show? They seem to infer that this is a really, really good hypothesis. And so I am among those who are greatly convinced on the basis of the evidence that we really have to take this man, Jesus, very, very seriously. And so I do. And I hope that others watching the show would possibly think to do that themselves. Did we lose sound?
No,
we still got you.
The moderator was going to pick up in there.
No, you guys are open discussion for 40 minutes, so just.
Oh, okay. I didn't know if we were going to move to different questions. Sorry.
Oh,
no. Open discussion, whatever you guys want to discuss.
Okay.
Yes, go ahead.
So I will concede to you any of the intrinsic implausibilities to the naturalistic hypotheses that you're suggesting. My argument is that even with all of those intrinsic likelihoods, that is still more likely than the laws of nature being violated from the outside. And we can make that inference based on the nature of religious testimony in general, by the history of religious testimony. So if that history had have been different, then we would all have, if we all had a sensus divinitatis, sort of, where we could all just sense God being, we didn't have to turn to historical evidence, we would then be sufficiently justified in that. So, and I'm saying that just by taking historical evidences into consideration in isolation just isn't sufficient enough, because you have to weigh all of the evidence. And the evidence that you're violating the laws of nature for a religious purpose to demonstrate the truth of a religion, we know these kinds of testimonies are wildly, wildly unreliable. And so I think that it's often quipped, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Well, there's a Bayesian formulation of that, and that's what I'm trying to articulate here, is that when you take all of the considerations, however intrinsically implausible you think they are still more probable than that miracle claim.
Yes. Here I would just simply argue, I think that it's been wonderfully shown by modern apologists that obviously anytime we're talking about the intrinsic likelihood of something, we're talking essentially about sort of the statistical likelihood of something, a set event coming about, whatever that event may be. Now, that's always going to be relative to a certain body of background information. And if that background information includes sufficiently good reasons to believe, for example, in the existence of God, then we have permission to look at each of these historical events and consider whether or not a given miracle event is indeed very plausible or
likely. I'll go ahead and concede that to you right now then. So, because you're then saying if there's other considerations that income and there's a cumulative case, that I think that's a more than acceptable move. And so we're in an open discussion. Let's move to some of those other considerations for God's existence. So I took you as understanding that if Christians have other good reasons to believe that God exists, then taking that in combination with the historical facts will then tip the scales in favor of the resurrection hypothesis. I'm with you. I think that's evaluating the evidence on its merits, and let's talk about it.
Yeah, and so I guess I would want to know, in the context of any of these types of discussions, I always traditionally ask, well, what do you think is unlikely about the various conclusions, which essentially the minimal facts arguments as presented by Professor Habermas, for example, or other arguments like this. What about these facts that most of us agree to, which all seem to have a bodily resurrection of Jesus in common? What about any of these facts seems implausible? Usually, I think that we've got to understand, obviously, that history is not giving to us deductively certain arguments. It's giving to us inductive arguments, and these arguments are basically all that we have to rely on. To say that it has to be otherwise, I think, really harms the basis for human epistemology in some pretty significant ways.
I agree.
Maybe we could talk about that at some point, but yeah. So
what do you think? That claim in the front of our minds, my claim about miracles is that the inductive inference, the one that we need to make for that religious claim, is not as strong as it needs to be. So I'll totally agree with you that's all we have to go by. It's not deduction, that it's induction and abduction, if we want to get really, really precise. I'm totally with you. I'm saying that the weight of evidence is on the other side of the scale.
In what sense?
In the sense of what we know about testimonies regarding miracle claims of a religious nature. That evidence, when you take all that evidence as a whole,
what do we know about it, though? What do we know about it? What do we know about that evidence? For example, you said what we know about that evidence. What do we know?
So we know that eyewitness testimony of miraculous events are prone to error, exaggeration, and deception. What we know about contemporary human psychology should make us downgrade our confidence in the reliability of testimony on behalf of miracles, especially ones of a religious nature. And so what you're going to need lots and lots of testimonies to back this up. So think of if scientists are trying to find a very, very elusive particle, they're going to have to get multiple testimonies. Multiple people are going to have to be there. They're going to have to have looked over the experiments and all agreed on certain things. Well, why is that? Why do we have to have all that? Why can't we just have two guys in a room looking for this particle? It's because we have to make those inductive inferences strong to overcome the evidence against it. We don't want to give into our own confirmation biases. So that's it's a psychological bias
certainly, yes,
that we all have. And so that's what's driving this skeptical worry about miracles, because I could think of it from my perspective as an atheist or just as a non-theist. I have a Christian and I have a Muslim, and they're making the exact same sorts of arguments, appealing to history, appealing to personal experiences.
I see.
And I'm trying to make a rational decision between the two.
Mm-hmm.
All I have from this third-person vantage is the weight of the evidence.
So it's a problem of underdetermination.
Sure. Yes, that's a great. I think that's a perfectly fair way of saying it. It's that the inferences that we need to those miracle claims for it to be justified are not anywhere near as strong as they need to be.
And what would make them strong? I guess.
So I gave the example earlier of us all having a universal conscious experience of a deity who had a relationship with us and communicated with us. This shared intersubjective experience we could just always refer to that intersubjective experience. Just like we can there's the question of human consciousness. We don't know what human consciousness is, but the intersubjective experience of us all having this, we all feel as if we're conscious. So if God could get, and so I think it's perfectly reasonable to make the claim, I know that I'm conscious. I think that is a perfectly reasonable claim to knowledge.
Now, what if a person's conscience is that this very experience that you've just discussed and articulated? What if our sense of there being a rightness and a wrongness of given that we should attribute to certain sorts of perhaps events, how do we decide that this is right or this is wrong, etc.? Our conscience is that. And so then if we simply go to the evidence itself, revisit the claims for the resurrection, we can look and see, do they stand on their own right? I do not think it is wise for us to say that we have to somehow refute every single naturalistic contrary.
I agree. I think that's largely new atheist rhetoric. So I think we would have a lot of common ground there.
Okay, good. Well, so then getting back to what I've just said is could it be that our conscience, all of us have a conscience.
I'm just for clarity. So yes. I was talking about consciousness. You're talking about a conscience now. Did we change?
I did. I changed.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure that I wasn't misunderstanding.
No. You're right on. You're right on.
Go ahead.
On task here. So
I got a very thick Southern drawl too. So sometimes it's no good.
Sure. Yes. Well, essentially, the rightness and the wrongness of certain actions, the sort of intrinsic moral
worth
quality to almost every decision that we make, couldn't this serve as that very thing? And given the ability of our minds to essentially differentiate between these two very curious ideas, which would fail to be explained by naturalism, I would say, of rightness and wrongness, couldn't that be the thing that could direct us in deciding ultimately on the basis of our evaluations whether or not Jesus was raised from the dead? For example, going back to what I noted a moment ago, why wouldn't the disciples facing deadly threat, we can argue whether or not they actually did suffer, all of them brutal, horrific deaths. That's another question altogether. But the fact of the matter is that they consciously would have known that they were facing this because the founder of the religion, in the words of Paley, had been crucified. Surely they were all in danger of the same thing. Who would rise to defend his memory and message? And so that would seem to be significant enough of a check against the disciples' witness. And yet they nonetheless stood forth with this bold and unusual claim that Jesus had been raised from the dead. So that would seem to surmount the idea that this was some sort of a contrived thing and had no reality whatsoever to begin with. And I think that those are the kinds of evidences that give us, those of us that are studying this, a pause to just think, wait a second, something else is going on here. Does that make sense?
Sure. So I would agree that when we have ethical inquiry and religious inquiry, we're using our sense of reason in these exploration of our questions to see if we can, find answers to our ethical questions and our religious questions, and
certainly
they're going to overlap. So,
yeah. Well, I wanted to get back to, and I want to make sure that we do this because I'm conscious of the fact that there's only 40 minutes here to our discussion. Maybe it's too short. My folks are in from out of town. I want to get back to hanging out with them. My wife's in the next room and at the dinner table. So I want to make sure that we actually get this part in, because essentially when it comes to sort of the supernatural agent thesis, just sort of leaving the resurrection behind for a moment, that essentially this really does seem to be something that is answerable by an argument that I have discussed in my own lecturing and my own articles as I've spoken on these things in a variety of contexts. Essentially, the argument here is what I would refer to, sometimes I refer to it as the Lord of the Matrix. So just start by imagining, for the sake of argument, just going back to the skeptic's hypothesis, that you really are just a brain in a vat. So since that's the classical argument, let's just go ahead and start there. So an evil mad scientist has cleverly wired your cerebrum, is now controlling your every sensory experience. Now, would it perhaps surprise you that you could still deduce, even in those kinds of straits, that God exists? And in fact, the argument turns out to be virtually irrefutable. Come what may, this divine conclusion that I'm describing persists. And so the case here really does ultimately hinge upon our understanding of mathematics. I hold that it's self-evidently true that whether we are awake in the real world or asleep in the matrix, 2 + 3 will nevertheless equal 5. And far from, basically, from what we know of math, it seems to me that it's flatly impossible for mathematical truths to somehow wind up being false. And so we can—
they're necessary truths.
They're necessary truths. That's right. And so these rules, these axioms, they are true even if it turns out that we're sleeping in the matrix. And so with that in mind, just go back to something that a lot of us have referred to, this idea of this collection of dominoes. I'll refer to this particular species of the argument as the ever-pending birthday. So just imagine that you walked into a room only to encounter an infinite row of tumbling dominoes. So each falling tile collapses the subsequent member and causes the preceding domino to plummet towards the earth. And now imagine that the row is just utterly beginningless, and it leads to a final domino standing near your foot. So bending down, you notice that the domino bears an inscription which reads the exact date of your birth. So you then begin to wonder, if the set of dominoes is infinitely long, how much time does it take for my birthday to arrive? Well, the answer is unavoidable. Your tile never falls, and so consequently you would never be born. And so for this reason, the matrix world cannot be eternal, right? Some initial trigger has to set the world in motion, because since a brain could not be invented if its person were never born, some inaugural set of affairs is necessary for us to create the story, or any story. Could be the story of Kaiser Sose, Van Helsing, the Swiss Family Robinson. Doesn't matter. Every story has to have some sort of a primordial beginning to it in order to explain how the other events are occurring. And so this initial cause has to exist eternally as well, since any finite cause would itself require some causal parent. And so from this point, really only one additional proof is needed to demonstrate that God is Lord of every world we imagine, or Lord of the Matrix. Final question.
So when you say he's Lord,
if the founding reason, if we say that the reason is something which lies outside of the cause itself, then it, and not the cause, is the real reason why the matrix world exists. So the parent cause of the world necessarily causes itself to cause the other causes to be set into motion. And that seems to imply a conscious will at work in the creation of any world we might imagine. And so that kind of an argument, because it strikes me as true in all cases, it's impossible to conceptually imagine a world in which this principle is violated, then it would seem that the notion of a conscious first cause, or God, if you will, is existent in every conceptual world that we imagine. And that seems to me to be a good enough reason to conclude, again, going back to the closure principle, if P not Q, well, if I have good evidence for P, and an axiomatic evidence is certainly good evidence, then I conclude not Q. Does that make sense? So what do you think of that sort of an argument?
So it sounds to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like a variation of the cosmological argument. And so, as I understand cosmological arguments in their most general form, is that they start with some fact about the universe that can't explain itself. So it seems like the domino example. You're looking for an explanation of why the dominoes are falling. and that you can't, it can't just explain itself. And
Right.
so then the argument tries, excuse me,
Yes.
to appeal to some principle which implies that there must be an explanation of this fact. That this fact, that there's these dominoes falling,
Right.
would just be a brute fact. And then the argument tries to say, well, the explanation of this fact must involve something that explains itself, a necessary being, or an unmoved mover, or
Right.
something of that nature. And then the last move is to then connect this God to the God of basically the perfect being thesis, the distance from the supernatural agent thesis to the perfect being thesis. They want to say that, and Thomas Aquinas famously said, and everyone knows this to be God. So
yes,
that more or less
the argument, yes.
form of argument that you're going with.
Yeah, and so the question is, what about that is unpersuasive?
So the first major problem that I have with it is what's known as the gap problem. So it's what I just mentioned, the space between the supernatural agent thesis and the perfect being thesis. So when we ask religious questions, we are searching for questions with religious answers that have importance to our life. If they have importance in our life, then they have some sort of normative component to them. They can be somehow good or bad, right or wrong. And so we want to know about the moral properties of this being. Well, I don't think that cosmological arguments get us anywhere as far as the moral properties of this creator. So even if we concede all of the premises of the cosmological argument in their entirety, the best it does is it gets us to deism. Second problem I would have is I don't even think it gets us to deism, because what we're appealing to is something outside of the universe that's beyond our experience, that is also itself a mind. Well, I've already given reason to think that minds have physical structures. So when you say that this necessary being that you're using to explain these contingent facts as a mind that is causally, that is non-spatial and non-temporal, but can somehow reach out and cause creation from literal nothing, it makes about as much sense to me as, thinking I can throw up the lunch I ate yesterday with a sufficient dry heave. It just doesn't make sense to me. So that would be the second worry that I have with it.
That's two. Okay.
The third worry that I would have with it is that these cosmological arguments always appeal to some sort of metaphysical principle, whether it be a causal principle or something like the principle of sufficient reason. So I don't know I don't know where I am with the principle of sufficient reason these days, or with principles of causation. It's still an area I'm exploring. I'm trying to, learn more about, but I don't know what the right answers are. And I'll just go ahead. I guess I'll just admit that.
Sure.
Right from the start. So for every plausible metaphysical principle, there's, my third worry is, well, what are the other competing metaphysical principles here? What side of the dialogue have I seen, and what sides haven't I seen?
Sure, and we have to rule those out in order to know that the one is right.
Well, I don't know. Maybe there will be some sort of deductive proof that is just, or a mathematical proof that just goes, look, this has to be
that's exactly, yes, that's exactly what I've argued that this argument does. It is axiomatic. Axioms are self-evident, irreducible crimes. They're not just opinions that we have in some sort of a general sense. A conglomeration of people from culture believe this, and so we just simply hold it as an axiom. I would say that's a weak definition. Axioms are self-evident, like mathematical axioms. They're irreducible. In other words, there are not things that they themselves are founded on, but these are the foundation.
Sure.
And so essentially, to me, the idea that a grand cause to all causes, so go ahead and capitalize that one, exists, that sets the other causes in motion, and that the reason why this cause did that lies within itself and not in some other external cause, seems to imply that this is at least part of the definition of what it means to be God. Now, as far as sort of disentangling that from competing definitions, again, that to me seems to be that's right back to religious skepticism, right back to the very things that would seem to rely, that defends the second premise of the argument, as I said, using Nozick's sensitivity requirement. We can't see these things, we can't sense these things, our beliefs about them aren't sensitive, and so therefore we can't know, not Q, therefore we can't know P. And when one does that, the closure principle, if P not Q, implodes, and with that goes reason. And so then the theist just simply responds by saying, well, it's no wonder you don't believe in God. You're doubtful about knowledge itself. Because you're saying that if P not Q, this very, if I'm justified in believing P and P implies Q, then of course Q. That just seems to be intuitively plausible to most of us.
It's a rational intuition.
It's a rational intuition. So
sure.
Most philosophers are just simply unwilling to give up the closure principle, even if doing so winds up defending the cause of atheism, because it bears such a strong appeal to logic and reason. And so if we have to give up the closure principle by holding on to Nozick's sensitivity requirement, then I would say we're giving up on, it's almost tantamount to giving up on reason. And that's why I can't go there. I just can't justify an argument that not only does it argue against God, but not more foundationally, probably equally as foundationally is what I would say. Equally as foundationally, it actually questions our basis for knowledge and how we know true propositions. And that's just simply too grand of an epistemological leap for me to make just to prove atheism, for example. And
so do you think that I've made those epistemological leaps in any of the arguments that I've given tonight?
Well, I think that to some extent, you almost have to, if you're saying that that disentangling our thesis, for example, the axiomatic argument and this causal entity from all the other possible options that are out there, psychological or philosophical, whatever those doubts may be based on, I think that already commits itself to Nozick's sensitivity requirement, just right from go. In which case, how do we quite know something? I don't think the tracking theories of knowledge, which Nozick walked out, are very effective. I think that they have problems of their own. Nozick knew that. And so I think that any theory of knowledge, which we are going to assent to, has to agree that closure is right. Closure is important, even if it's not. If we have certainty of P, then we know with certainty not Q. It could be, I'm justified in believing to this degree that P, therefore I'm justified in also saying to this degree or greater, or to some extent, not Q. And to me,
guys, we got about 5 minutes left.
Okay.
So just to the audience, if you haven't gotten your question yet and you have a question for either Ben, go ahead and send it in, tag at Modern Day Debate. We got about 4.5 minutes left to go, so go ahead and start giving your closing thoughts.
You go ahead.
So I guess I would just close with, so my intent coming here tonight was to try to answer the question, does God exist? And to just give arguments for that. So I didn't come prepared with epistemological arguments or, well, I guess I did come to the table with an epistemological argument in my miracle section, but I didn't come to discuss the like the closure principle. I don't know if I have the right answer to the questions that are being asked there. I don't know, even if I've really fully understood the questions there. So I don't know if I'm going to be able to comment too substantively there. So I do apologize for that. But in closing, I just want to recap what I had done. The first layer of the God hypothesis was supernatural agent thesis, and I thought that what we know about the physical dependency of mind gives us reasons to believe that thesis is false. And then I looked at the perfect being thesis, and I looked at the argument from evil and the argument from divine hiddenness, and I think those are really strong arguments against the perfect being thesis. And then I gave a skeptical argument on belief in miracles of a religious nature.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that undercuts a biblical thesis. And I will turn over to Mr. Fischer now.
Okay. Okay. Well, I've just so I've come and I've perhaps done something a bit unorthodox to these type of discussions. My goal has been to just simply not just to simply give a positive case, but to actually undercut what I see as the problems behind much religious skepticism in a general sense. I think that they lead us to inadequate theories of knowledge. And I think that that therefore becomes perhaps a reason why it is that the atheist is saying, well, we can't really know. What can we really know about God to begin with? He's hidden problems of religious skepticism concerning miracles, etc. And so I think that I want to hold on to the idea of there being a rational reason to essentially reject these type of hypotheses. In the end, they simply seem to not only disembowel our knowledge of God, but disembowel our knowledge about knowledge. And to me, that becomes a major problem. And that's one of the reasons I would simply say to the atheist, let's just say, hypothetically speaking, that I did wish to become an atheist. And I'm trying to believe that atheism is true. But I see that these problems are there at a fundamental epistemological, philosophical basis. So I'm wrestling with these, and let's say that I become still lack. And it seems to me that if I remain committed to knowledge, and if I remain committed to the idea that axioms are true, for example, and that these things must necessarily be, that therefore I'm just sort of stuck with theism. Of course, as a Christian, I don't have any problem with that. I don't. But I'm just simply posing that as a sort of a tantalizing hypothetical sort of situation that we might ponder. And so I offer that to the atheist tonight.
Would it be fair to say that you believe knowledge implies theism then?
I think that if we say that we know anything, that what we are doing is we are assenting to what Sextus Empiricus argued was a form of foundationalism. And foundationalism is historically taken on two distinct forms, presuppositionalism and the axiomatic argument. I don't believe that we're justified in just simply presupposing any old thing we like. That just seems to me to be a poor starting point for almost any philosophical question. But when it comes to axioms,
would you say these because you're trying to distance yourself from a presuppositional apology?
Yes, I don't really. I wouldn't call myself a.
That's fair. No, I just want to make sure I got it.
I would consider myself to be a Christian foundationalist.
Okay, no, that's fair.
I hold to axiomatic truths as self-evident, and I for that reason find myself.
Would something like Alvin Plantinga's Reformed epistemology, like properly basic beliefs, would that be more along your style?
Well, I think that those are certainly interesting ideas in their own right. I'm trying to sort of
fair enough.
Distance myself from it because I don't really, at the end of the day, find myself to be in a place where I agree with Cornelius Van Til and these kinds of thinkers.
You got your own unique monster that you're working with. I like it.
Yeah. Essentially, it's just Christian foundation.
We're actually doing philosophy. Cheers.
All right. Yes, that's right. Yeah, I'll just heads up with the water I've got here.
There you go.
Well, thanks so much for that, you guys. That was a very interesting interaction. I'm sure a lot of people got a lot out of that. I know I certainly am going to watch this back again just to kind of work through some of the things that I missed while I was checking out the chat. So we got some questions in, so we're just going to move into Q&A for about 25 minutes, or at least however long they last. But I just wanted to first say that to show appreciation to James, if you would like this video, if you haven't yet, also hit that subscribe button. I know you've been wanting to. If you haven't, definitely do it, because we have some huge debates coming up. Like, there are some really awesome debates that I'm super excited about coming up. So first we have Michael Dresden, thanks so much for your $2 super chat. Bored of watching atheists lose every time. Taking shots. He's got another one. Michael Dresden, $2. Atheists don't see evidence because they don't want to. Do you have anything that you want to say anything about that?
So I would say that evidence is normative. So it's about what we should, ought, or must believe. So my particular desires of what I want to believe are pretty much irrelevant to what is reasonable to believe. So I think that I'm using a rational process in my inquiry, but I'm probably wrong about everything. So we'll see.
All right.
I guess that's the risk I take for thinking for myself. I don't know.
Thanks so much for that answer. Jay Shy, thank you so much for your $5 super chat. Evil is the lack of good. In order to get rid of evil, God will have to get rid of good or free will. Not every being will choose to do what's good. Not sure who that one was for. Either you care to?
Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead, Fischer. Take this one.
So I should try to take this one.
You want me to reread it?
Sure. I'm not sure that I quite understood the goal or aim of the.
I'm not sure there was a question there.
Yeah, there wasn't a question, but it's just evil is the lack of good. In order to get rid of evil, God will have to get rid of good or free will. Not every being will choose to do what's good. So I think he's saying because we have free choice, there's gonna be evil.
So
and maybe that's
a combination of two theodicies there. So there's the privation of evil, that that evil is the privation of good view, and that's one type of theodicy for responding to the problem of evil. And then there's the free will theodicy, saying that because we are free creatures, or significantly free creatures, that if God wanted to eliminate all evil, he would, in order to do that, he'd have to eliminate the great good of free will. I think that's what they're getting at. I don't think that necessarily the free will and the privation of good thing are connected, or maybe they are. I don't know.
Yeah, I question that same point. I didn't quite understand the one-to-one correspondence between those 2 points either. But I certainly do think that when it comes to, I think essentially Sextus Empiricus's discussion here concerning the problem of evil essentially has 5 premises. If God is all powerful, he can create any world he wants. If God is all loving, he prefers a world with no suffering. In an all powerful, or if an all powerful, all loving God exists, it follows that suffering does not. Suffering exists, God doesn't. So that's essentially the argument. And I think what he's saying here is that the first premise wholly depends on God's creating only certain kinds of worlds. For example, suppose that God wants to create a world populated by free creatures who can either choose to do good or evil. Then in that case, it would be impossible for God to force us to freely choose to be virtuous. Right? You can't force someone to make a free choice. So far from this showing that God is not all powerful, the point would merely argue that God cannot do the logically impossible. So therefore, it isn't necessarily true that if God is all powerful, he can create a world, or he creates a world with no suffering. So that much I think that much I would grant, because I think that seems right to me, and probably right to many of us who are on the theist side of the discussion. Probably most of us would relate to that in some way. So
yeah, well, thanks so much for those interesting answers. We have Jay Shy again for $10. Thank you so much for your super chat. Divine hiddenness is demanding God to show you himself in a way that will force you to believe. Also, if you presuppose naturalism, how will you accept any evidence without God forcing himself onto you? I guess that one's for you, Ben Watkins.
So I don't think that God would have to force himself on us. I think that's a narrow way of thinking about how God could communicate with us. So, and I also, my argument didn't appeal to anything about what I wanted. Again, my desire is irrelevant. I was appealing to the normative implications of perfect love and God's openness. So the point that I'm trying to make is that if I'm starting from the top down, so to speak. So I'm starting with the concept of a being that's always worthy of worship, and that implies perfect love. And so I'm taking the concept of perfect love and I'm deriving this notion of openness. That think of the analogy between a perfectly loving parent and their child. The mother is not going to force themselves on the child, but they're going to make sure that nothing they do puts relationship with their child out of reach. So if their child wants to have a relationship, they will always be able to have that relationship just by trying.
All right. Thank you so much for that question, and thank you so much for that super chat, Jay Shy. All right. The Undead Christian, $5 super chat. Thank you so much for that. For Ben, I'm guessing Watkins. Do you consider the Big
Did they
Bang?
really just say for Ben?
Yeah, that's so.
Come on, there's no way I could let that slide. There's no way I was just gonna let that go.
Big.
Well, Undead Christian, thank you so much for your $5 super chat. For Ben, do you consider the Big Bang a supernatural event, considering space was all a void with nothing in it, naturally speaking?
I do not consider it a supernatural event. I am what's known as a metaphysical naturalist, so I believe that the universe is a causally closed system. So I'll go ahead and concede that I don't know what before the Big Bang means, much like I don't know what north of the North Pole means. Conceptually, I don't really understand it. I know that there's a lot of work in contemporary cosmology about a multiverse and how that our universe might be one of many bubble universes in a world ensemble. I don't know. I don't know the answers to those deep cosmological arguments, but I do accept that as a cosmological fact that there was an event, the Big Bang, where our ability to describe the singularity, the cosmic singularity, our ability to describe it classically breaks down. To describe it mathematically just breaks down. And so I don't think we're really going to have a good answer to this until we get that unifying theory between quantum mechanics and general relativity. That's getting way, way in the weeds. So yeah.
Well, thank you so much for that interesting answer. And we have Keith X. Thank you so much for your $5 super chat. Question for Ben. Ben said, if infinite, then X will never come to pass. If there was infinite line at, I think this might be McDonald's MCD drive-through, is he saying number one would ever get to the drive-through window?
So I assume that's for me then.
Yeah. Would you like me to repeat it one more time?
No, I think I understand it. Essentially, okay. I think that's true. Let's just go ahead and, for example, say that Ben down here is at Starbucks and he's at the line, he's ordering his drink, and then he looks down the aisle of cars and he sees me, and I'm there receiving my drink. Now, let's say that there's an infinite number of cars between us. I think that we would all admit that Ben is therefore never going to arrive at the window to get his container of Starbucks, in which case he's probably going to have a miserable morning. So, yes, I think that's true. I think it absolutely seems to me that the very axioms of math force us to that conclusion.
Well, thank you so much for that answer, Ben. We have Brian Stevens, who is always in the stream. Brian asks, question, is it possible, yes or no, that the followers of Jesus could have been convinced of something that was not true and be willing to die for it? I'm guessing this is for you, Ben Fischer.
Yes, I believe that. So I think that history has taught us that human psychology, people will die for all sorts of outlandish things. That's not to imply that, this is outlandish, in a pejorative way. But we know that people will go to very, very great lengths for false beliefs. It's unfortunately just part of human psychology.
Now, I know Brian Stevens, and he probably would not like it too much if Ben Fischer didn't give an answer to this question.
Fair enough.
Okay. Well, I think that from the point that I left off in describing basically the case for Easter, I think that our list of probable options begins to narrow significantly from there. It dramatically shrinks. Hallucinations, for example, become an unlikely candidate for producing religious visions which were so vastly different from earlier Jewish beliefs. And so the fact that skeptical scholarship argues a pagan route to Easter suggests that the case indeed cries out for some kind of external inspiration, which would mean hallucinations cannot account for the disciples' visions, since religiously inspired delusions are only projections of our minds. I think that really this point alone seems to me to say that something outside of the disciples was causing them to think and come to conclusions which were so different from their earlier Jewishness. James D.G. Dunn, for example, notes that given the previous Jewishness of the disciples, belief in Jesus' resurrection is really an unexpected development. Why conclude it was Jesus raised from the dead? Why not simply a vision of the dead man? Oh, there he is in heaven. Wave at him. Thank you, God, that Jesus made it to heaven. Why draw the astonishing conclusion that the resurrection had already taken place in the case of a single individual? And so there, essentially, the cumulative case just simply turns to another fact and says, how does the notion that they were just simply making this up, how does that show that, how does that explain the very points we've just established here? And so that's kind of how I would begin to answer the question.
All right, thanks so much for that, Ben. Cameron P. asked, at Modern Day Debate, ask Benjamin why humans wear clothes. The Bible explains why anything else doesn't make sense. Let's try that again.
Okay.
Ask Benjamin why humans wear clothes. The Bible explains why anything else doesn't make sense. You want to try and make sense of that one?
So I will go ahead and say that I don't know the exact answer to that question. From my understanding of human anthropology, there's three things that are essential to sustaining human life: food, shelter, and clothing. So I assume that clothing provided some sort of survival advantage, and that's why it became part of our society and our species. Maybe fashion had something to do with it too. I don't know. It's an interesting question.
All right, thank you so much for that, because actually you helped me piece that one together. I originally thought it was for Ben Fischer, but I see now it's ask Benjamin why humans wear clothes, because the Bible explains why, and anything else doesn't make sense. I got you. Okay.
So I would prefer an explanation from anthropology to one from the Bible.
All right, thanks so much for that explanation. We have Subtracted for $5. Thank you so much for your super chat. How did God exist before time itself existed? Before is a period in a spatial timeline. Ben Fischer?
Oh, so that's directed to me.
Well, it doesn't say, but I would.
I think he's asking about God's relationship to time, basically.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's a good one for Fischer.
Because he's saying that time is that existence is a period in a spatial timeline. How did God exist before time?
So the classical understanding would essentially would have been potentially okay with there being moments before the moment of time. I don't know that my view would be one that would be congruent with that sort of a notion. I rather think that God acts and causes creation, that God's causing creation and the effect itself are coincident, and that they signify the first moment, and that before that, there was no sequential reality. For example, it is not as though God was engaged in some sort of an eternal discussion. So the Father says this, Jesus says this, the Holy Spirit says this, and this was going on from eternity, because there you're running into some of the same arguments that I noted in the case of the dominoes. So I rather think that there is nothing sequential in God. In other words, all of God's thoughts are present to him in sort of an immediate eternal now. Jesus said before Abraham was, I am. The angel said to Moses from the bush, I am that I am. So I think that these kinds of designations point to there being nothing sequential in God, such that we could not take, for example, 100 of God's thoughts, bring them onto the debate screen here tonight and set them in a sequential order, because God doesn't engage himself in some sort of a discursive inward discussion. I think all of his thoughts are present to him, and then he acts, and his acting to create is actually coincident with the effect it creates.
All right, thanks, Ben, for that explanation. Next, we have, let's see. That was the same question there from earlier. Stupid Whore Energy is what she calls herself, folks. Stupid Whore Energy, thank you so much for your $5 super chat. She's always in the stream, always giving super chats. There is no number one in an infinite timeline. You can start from any time in an infinite past and get to the present in discrete steps.
But that would assume that infinite values can be divided, which they can't. That would disobey the math, the axioms of math. So,
okay, thank you so much for that. Stupid Whore Energy, again, $2 super chat. Thank you so much for that. Very generous. What does now mean in timelessness?
Well,
so timelessness. So now is a presentist term. So it's just a contradiction in terms.
Sure, yeah, and I could certainly grant that possibly could sound self-defeating or something like that. I essentially think here that without some sort of an eternal causal parent to all causes, you just simply can't get the string of causes going. So the only explanation for this is a cause that has always existed eternally. As to whether or not it's proper to call it an eternal now, let's go ahead and leave that up for discussion. Well played to the super chat, and we'll go ahead and leave it at that.
Well played, Super Whore Energy. Subtracted $2. Thank you so much for your super chat. Causation is an action which requires time.
So he's saying that all of our experiences of causation have been causes in time. So if we're then applying our principles of causation that are derived from our experience, we're applying them to a point in the universe where they just might not apply.
Yes, and I think here, given the sort of irreducible nature of the very argument I've given, you have to have some sort of a first cause. I don't see how we can rationally avoid that. It seems to me that we're never rationally justified in saying that has to be swept off the table. Else, nothing else happens. A universe that is not triggered itself triggers nothing. It seems to me that that's self-evidently true. And so
this all really comes down to the perennial question of philosophy: why is there something rather than nothing? And so on one level, this question is obvious. The answer is there's always been something. But then the question becomes, what is the nature of this something that has always existed?
Yes.
And so there's competing answers to this. And Mr. Fischer prefers the theistic hypothesis, where I would probably put something more like a multiverse hypothesis forward.
All right, thank you so much for that. Let's see, make sure we don't have any more. I think that was the last question we had, and then we can get you guys out of here. Okay. All right, yep, I believe that's it. Well, thanks so much, Ben and Ben, for those interesting responses. This has been a productive interaction, I think. I don't believe you actually even needed a moderator. You guys are such gentlemen and very cordial, so it's more like a collegiate discussion than what a lot of times we see. But
yes.
High five for that one.
Yeah, if it were possible, we could do that. Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah. Well, I really appreciate both of you guys being here. I appreciate all the audience for being here. Thanks for all the super chats. The usual suspects are in the chat, of course. And one more time, if we could just do a favor for James, if you haven't hit the like button, hit it. And then also, if you haven't subscribed yet, feel free to hit that subscribe button and follow my lead and become a patron. And then with that, Keep sifting the reasonable from the unreasonable.